Meeting's being recorded. Welcome everybody to the Equity Pandemic Learning and Pods and conversation. We want to thank you all for coming. I know that many of you have been living your lives on Zoom. And so I always start every conversation by saying we thank the fact that you are taking the time to come and participate in the conversation with us. My name is Richard Gray. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. Very quickly, the Metro Center was founded 40 plus years ago by Lamar Miller, really focused on the tradition of research in service of directing and being involved in real questions. And so it's always been about action research. The Metro Center has really focused on issues that have looked at the impact of segregation on communities, but particularly looking for those policies and practices that are most effective for student populations that have traditionally been underserved. We do that through professional development, supporting community organizing with research and technical assistance, and work on a range of issues that include not only issues around disproportionality, culturally responsive and supportive education, disproportionality, but a range of issues that we believe are central to being able to address the necessary conditions that we need for public schools. In short, our focus has always been on building communities that are engaged in the process, particularly those communities that are most affected by policy. How can they be involved in the conversation? Collaboration, how do we make sure that we're not working in isolation from the others, but particularly engaging parents, communities, and educators in solutions, and really focused on issues of racial and social justice, and making sure that the work that we're doing is in the forefront of how do you impact and make this a more equitable and just world, in particular, a more equitable and just school system. And I think this conversation is consistent with that principle. So what we're going to ask you to do, as I've introduced myself, is we want you to go to the chat and we want you to essentially introduce yourselves. Give your name, your school, your district. A part of our principles is also adding your preferred pronouns so that people know how to address you and can address you respectfully. And one question or one word about why you are here. And so we want to do that. And as many of you know, being on Zoom, we have to be very intentional about creating community. And so we want to make sure that people feel that they can use the chat as a way to be able to engage in this conversation. We have a lot of people on this webinar and we don't have a chance to have a direct interaction, but that's the place to be able to share your thoughts, and we want them and welcome them. We will have questions there that we won't be able to get to all of them. We're going to try our best to get to as many of them, but they're documented and we're recording this. And so this becomes a part of the record and history of this conversation. And so your input is valuable. And we ask that you try to, as best you can, to keep your comments directed to the topic of the question. It doesn't mean that you can't add something or add an element to it, but we're trying to make it a conversation, so that we ask that you do that. And as you're doing that and putting those in, we're seeing some great contributions. I'm also going to ask for you to contribute in another way so that folks know who's in the room. And we're going to do a little bit of polling just to know who's in the room and give you a sense of who you're sharing this experience with. And so I'm looking virtually to Cindy to put up the first poll question. And what is your role in public education? Choose all that apply. And again, this will give us an opportunity once people vote to be able to see who's in the room with us. Okay. And I believe after everybody votes, it says the hosts and participants can't vote. So I was trying to vote and it was not letting me do so. But now I understand why. I need to read further into the instructions. So Cindy, will we see the result of the poll shortly?
Yeah, maybe we'll give it like 15 more seconds for everyone to answer.
Okay, that's terrific. I just needed to know how long I needed to be able to continue to talk. This is always a useful thing to even do in person, because it gives you a sense of who's in the room and allows for the participants and the panelists to be able to know how to respond to questions and what issues to hit.
All right, so we're gonna end the poll now and see results.
And the results are?
Can you all see that?
No, cannot.
Okay, let's see.
Maybe that's just me.
Share results.
There we go. Okay, wow. So we have 79% parent caregiver, 36% educator, 5% students, and 36% community members. And so we see a range of folks that are here. Appreciate you all participating. You have another question? If you have a child in school, the question will come up. If you have a child in school, will they be attending? And the questions there, fully online, hybrid, in-person, face-to-face. Again, as we'll be talking about the issues, a lot of the kinds of questions that people will be grappling with, the choices they need to make will be a part of the conversation. And so it's helpful for us to know where you are in the process, and helps us give a sense of how to respond. Okay.
Okay, last couple seconds.
Last couple seconds. All right, all right.
Okay.
Oh, so we have almost a mix here of half, a little over half fully online and 47% hybrid. Thank you so much for that. The next question, have you considered getting into a pandemic pod? Yes, no, unsure. This is, I always find these helpful for me, because even though it's supposed to be for our event, I often find these kinds of engagements interesting with people who have come on this, and it gives you a sense of who else is in the room as well and who's grappling with this question.
Okay, seems like all the answers are about in.
All right. And the results will be, okay, again, we're having almost a sort of equal mix of yes, 39% yes, 42% no, and then about 20%, about a fifth that are unsure. So this is a good place to have the conversation, to be able to get some information about that. And I think we have one more question, poll question, is that correct? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If yes, what is your main goal, the goal of your pod? Childcare, emotional, social and emotional development, academic. Again, this would be main. It doesn't mean that preclude there being all of them. It's just one that sort of comes to mind, or is the one that's driving you. Okay, a few more seconds. All right. And there we go. That's a real significant social and emotional development. And that's very consistent with what we're hearing. It's a natural thing, particularly coming out of the experiences that we're having, that we want to make sure that schools, in addition to supporting the academic success and being places where we know our kids are being taken care of, we also want to know that there are places that are going to be able to respond to and support them, both in their academic development, but coming out of the experiences and being in the middle of the experiences that we're dealing with in the pandemic. And that seems to be a consistent notion. So thank you all for that. So let's go quickly to, and I want to set up very briefly the conversation that we'll be having with our great colleagues here. But I wanted to give a little bit of context for why we're here. And I think everybody goes without saying when you say preaching to the choir, and everybody is in the middle of some very difficult conversations. We've been going through a global pandemic, dealing with issues that have both confronted us in terms of the violence that we've seen perpetrated against our communities. And we're also dealing with economic uncertainty. And so it has created a mix where people are feeling every piece of what's going on in the world. And in the middle of all that, we now have to make choices, impossible choices often for parents, about where our kids go, right? Wanting to make sure that we send them to a place that's safe, but also knowing we want them to be in a space where they're engaging other students in learning and developing. And often those choices put us in what we feel like is an impossible situation. Very little guidance and support from government entities that should be providing some leadership in this moment. So where are people looking to get answers for safety net issues, resources that they need for their homes in this particular setting? Why are we all being left to make the best decision individually and not really being given guidance? And I think even more importantly and consistent with this conversation, how do we make sure that the best decision that we're making for ourselves is aligned with the best decision that we're making for our communities? If this pandemic has taught us nothing else, it's taught us that the choices that we make have impact on other people. And so how do we begin to take that same type of concept into our decisions around education? And of course, many of us have access to being able to make these decisions in a position of privilege, whether that privilege comes from our race, from our economic setting, from access to resources and information, which means that the conversation about our choices in that privilege require us to be much more intentional about making sure that our isolation, the isolation that's often created by privilege, doesn't have us actually make choices that make situations worse, less equitable for other communities. And so this is a conversation that we want to have that allows for us to figure out what are the principles and practices that allow for us to make a collective choice, collective decision, and create collective support for the broader community that has to deal with this very difficult decision. So to that end, I want to turn this over to a conversation between Dr. Lewis McCoy and my wonderful colleague, Megan Hester, who heads up our Educational Justice Research and Organizing Collaborative. And they will take us through a conversation and a set of questions. And then once we go through that, we'll have an opportunity to hear a set of emerging equity-driven principles through their conversation, some examples of best practices, and some opportunities for organizing and advocacy, particularly those that are led by people of color who are pushing for more equitable choices and resources in this context. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan Hester.
Great, thanks, Richard. Good, well, I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing Dr. R. LaRue Lewis McCoy, a colleague and scholar on this topic. So I'm just gonna give a little background on who Dr. Lewis McCoy is, and then we're gonna jump into a conversation on these topics that Richard has kind of laid out for us. So Dr. Lewis McCoy is an associate professor in the Sociology of Education program at NYU's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. His research concentrates on educational inequality, particularly the intersecting roles of race, class, and place. His first book, Inequality in the Promised Land, examined the experiences of low-income families and families of color's attempts to access school resources in an affluent suburb. And he's now working on a second book that focuses on Westchester County and residents' experiences with housing in schools. And his research has appeared in a lot of books and academic journals. He's also a public school parent here in New York City. So Dr. Lewis McCoy, you have been studying opportunity hoarding and the dynamics of privilege in school for a very long time. And so I wonder if you could just kick us off by sort of explaining, what are pods? How do you define pandemic pods? How are they being formed? And what are some of the equity issues that they raise?
Great. Thank you for that question, Megan. So pandemic pods mean a range of things, and it depends upon who you ask. And part of the conversation right now has been really driven by what New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN are keying in on. But pandemic pods come out of a place where folks are very uncertain about what education looks like in the fall and throughout the year to come. So we know in the springtime, many schools shut down or went to remote online learning. And the question of school reopening has not gotten clearer as we move closer. So depending on where you are in the country, sometimes schools are already open and you're face-to-face. In other parts of the country, if you live here in New York, right, we welcomed the news of de Blasio saying, hey, guess what? We still haven't figured this out. We need a little bit more of a delay. So the question of whether you're going to be online, in person, hybrid, right, it's very unclear. So in response to that uncertainty, what parents have done is try to create some stability. And there are three main things that parents seem to be looking for. One, there's safety. So the idea that we're still in the midst of a pandemic, and despite what we know about science, we still need to enact best practices to actually reduce the spread of this virus. So making sure that kids aren't having a lot of exposure. Number two, folks are interested in the social emotional development of children, right? So having kids home for months on end and having lack of access to peers, lack of access to many of the ways that young people spend time and develop their relationships through sports and social hangouts, not having that is very meaningful. So folks are looking for the social emotional part. Then the third part is people are also often looking for an academic portion. Because online learning was so hard, and it was so hard for everyone for a myriad of issues, people have said, you know what, I thought I was really smart. I thought I was a really committed parent, but online learning kicked my butt, right? And I realized that I probably am not doing as well for my child as I could. So enter pandemic pods. Now, pandemic pods at base could look like we saw in the spring. So a lot of our more vulnerable families around the country said immediately, hey, the country's shutting down. They're saying that unless you're an essential worker, you can take time off, you can adjust. But many folks who are essential workers do things like bag groceries, deliver food, work in hospitals, and their children immediately needed childcare. So one of the first places I saw these emerge was actually mutual aid. There was a place of childcare. But as time has worn on and as we're going back to school, we've seen more and more families with means, with material privileges and advantages saying, look, I'm going to create a stable environment for my family. And so what that looks like is usually a pod is between 3 to 5 families, and they are in community and they make an agreement. The idea is to try to minimize the harm around safety. The idea is to have a set of kids that your child can interact with to compensate for the social emotional. And in some pods in particular, particularly for families who have more resources, there's been the hiring of private tutors and teachers. Now, what that means is when you hear the word pandemic pod, there's a whole range of experiences, right? At the base is uncertainty, but what's happened is because, as Richard said earlier, we don't have clear leadership at the federal level, and we have a little bit clearer level leadership at the state, but very unclear level at the cities as well around what it will take to educate children well. That means folks have taken matters into their own hands. The problem is when you leave people to their own hands, they choose from the choices that are in front of them. And we already lead deeply segregated lives. Our lives are segregated economically. Our lives are segregated educationally. Our lives are segregated racially, ethnically, linguistically. So it looks like as a parent who's trying to figure out what do I do about my child's schooling, they immediately reach into their proverbial Rolodex and they're like, all right, who can I call up? I can call up person A, B, and C that I know from school. And the odds are that that person shares your same educational background, often shares your same race, often shares your same linguistic uses. And so it means that even our communities are segregated, our schools are segregated, but these pods are probably going to be even more segregated than that because we haven't given people instructions on how to construct them. And they're digging into pockets that are already segregated. So for me, when I think about pandemic pods, I think about the Titanic, right? So let's assume COVID is the iceberg, right? And everyone's on the Titanic and we hit the Titanic. No one's going to stay on the boat as is. Now, many of our most vulnerable families immediately got tossed into the water, some with life jackets, some without. And so that means in the spring, if you are a family that's vulnerable, you may have transitioned to online learning, but not even had the requisite technology that is necessary. Maybe you have a phone that works, but it's not sufficient for dealing with online learning. Maybe you have internet, but it's not stable, high quality internet, right? Many of the things that are at the base were not resolved in the spring. And when we look around the nation, haven't been resolved for the fall, right? And so those families are literally fighting for their life, trying to have a life vest, trying to tread water in the midst of really wide open space. For other families who are probably a bit more stable, a bit more middle class, what the pandemic often meant was you can adjust your living situation in some way, right? Everyone was inconvenienced, but maybe now, instead of being forced to go in, you work from home. Maybe now, instead of taking public transportation, you drive in your car, right? There are ways in which middle-class families were able to inoculate themselves from this virus to a degree that were not available to everyone. And so in turn, these folks have also started to look at pandemic pods and say, hey, how do I figure out what will make sure my child is safe and stable, right? Now, all parents are asking this question, but you have a few more material means. So it may not mean you hire the private teacher. May not mean you go and you pay somebody $2,000 a month, right? But it may mean you reach into your network and now you pull together people who are from the same background and you look, and everyone in your pod has a master's degree. But then when you look in your district, only 30% of parents in your district have master's degrees. Right? And then we have the third group. And the third group are often the folks who are most economically advantaged, most privileged, and they're the ones who have, in the midst of this crisis, said, hey, look, I'm not necessarily looking for a life jacket. A life raft would be nice, but if I use my resources, I can actually build myself a boat. I can build myself a speedboat to get the hell out of here. And what that often looks like are the creation of pods that are economically exclusive, that are racially exclusive, and in the midst of a crisis are going to lead them to accelerating far beyond where many other families are. And so for me as a sociologist, me as a parent, me as a Black person, I'm concerned that if we have almost 3 distinct trajectories happening in this one moment of school, its impact is going to be so large, it's hard for us even to fathom it right now.
Mm-hmm. And before we go on, I just wanted to let people know you can ask questions in the Q&A. We are going to have a question and answer session after a bit of conversation, and also feel free to chat, put any comments or thoughts in the chat. So LaRue, you've studied privilege in schools for a long time. And this is not new, right? This is a flashpoint in the current moment of inequality in our society. So what are the familiar themes that you see coming up? And how have you seen these dynamics of privilege play out in schools in other moments? And what are ways to to neutralize them, right? To minimize the impact that this has on inequality in our schools?
So you raise an important point, right? So right now, everyone's talking about school reopening and talking about learning pods and pandemic pods and what do we do? And in 1 month, when no one's talking about them, the same issues are going to be really central, right? So you can pick your area. I don't care if you look at New York City. I don't care if you look at Westchester County. I don't care if you look at Inland Empire. What you'll first find are the depths of economic segregation. And economic and racial segregation are not just what happens now, but it has been the systematic divestment from communities and investment in other communities. So whenever I'm thinking about schools and where we are, we still have to remember the fundamental thing that drives American education and public education, which is where the majority of American kids attend school, are local property taxes. We have a system that is grossly unequal. It has started on unequal footing, and even attempts to correct that have fallen far short. So in a place like New York City, where we know that communities that have had high numbers of residents living at, near, and below the poverty line, schools that have been underfunded for decades, we know that when we had a legal battle to actually get a form of taxation and a reinvestment, right? You'll hear later from the Alliance for Quality Education. When we won that battle, New York State started to say, yes, we need to give money to those areas that were underserved. And then the financial crisis hit and somehow the money dried up, right? And so there are schools and communities that are owed dollars that they were never given. And there are schools and communities that have walled themselves off and tried to accumulate more and more for themselves, right? And so it can become dangerous if we don't think about the terrain that we're on, because people make choices based on the terrain. There are actually very few school districts that are not segregated. So we can think about it racially, we can think about it economically. We also have to think about what are the choices that individual families make and how those individual choices also carry collateral consequences. Because every parent I've ever met, every parent who says, I care, they're like, hey, I want to do right by my kid. And I agree. Do right by your kid. I'm not telling you not to. I just want parents to think about the choices that we make around our children, how it may impact the child next to them, the child who's their classmate, or even the child who can't be their classmate because of how they've been locked out of a school. So in my own work, I've talked a lot about opportunity hoarding, which is really about the subtle ways that sometimes we use advantages to gain for an individual family, to gain for a group or a community. Often these are affluent white families, and it collectively disadvantages other folks. So it looks like having gifted and AP classes that look nothing like the school population, that look nothing like the city population. And then the answer is, well, maybe if we prep more kids to get into gifted and talented and advanced placement. Well, no, we've actually missed the root, right? that connection at the end of trying to test prep our way in misses how grossly unequal we are. So there's funding, there's segregation, there's everyday practices. And for me, I think we also have to think about in this moment, not only COVID, but the twin pandemic of police violence, right? So as someone who is Black, have been all my life, I realize that anti-Black violence, extrajudicial killings, police brutality are normative. And in this moment, they've sparked up again. But many of the students who have experienced this in their own families, those traumas have never actually been addressed, right? Our unwillingness to listen to families in need and to respond to their needs has led to an environment where the schools, even prior to COVID, weren't serving many of the people they needed best, right? They weren't serving Black kids. They weren't serving Latinx kids. They weren't serving a lot of kids who had IEPs, particularly if they came from more vulnerable communities. And so all of those are kind of bedrocks of things that we have to work against and push against, because in 1 month's time, in 2 months' time, when CNN isn't covering it, when Reuters doesn't want to have a chat about it, these are the same things that are going to be the drivers of inequality.
Yeah. And, you referenced this, but sometimes these conversations break down, right? Because families with privilege will say, well, I want to do what's best for my kid, right? I care about issues of equity in my school, but I have to do what's best for my kid. And it feels like we can't have this conversation without interrogating what that means, what is best for our children, and sort of rethinking the assumptions that underlie that. So I'm just wondering, how do you consider that? And how do you think about privilege in that context of what is best for my child?
Yeah. So I often encourage people to figure out, not even what's best, but let's start with what's necessary for your child. Because even the framework of best often leads us to, let me get everything I can and screw everybody else, right? There's a danger in that. The very root, at the root of the depth of segregation in our country, whether it's prior to the Brown decision or after the Brown decision, is I need to do what's best for my child. 2 weeks ago, there was a clip that was circulating from a documentary out of Queens, I believe it was Queens, in which folks were talking about the notion of desegregating schools, and children and parents and families were saying, no, I have to make the best decision for my child. There was a way that your self-interest, if you don't interrogate it related to larger systems of privilege, you're abdicating responsibility. I want the best for your child, but I also know that the collectivity of children that we are in care of, right? Because many of the folks in the room, we're not just parents. We're community members, we're loved ones, we're caregivers, and I believe deeply in the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. And oftentimes children are neglected when we start with what's best for my child. Number two, I would say, if you want to do best, this is a great opportunity to show your children what best looks like in the midst of a crisis. In the midst of a crisis, do my parents panic? Do we batten down the hatches? Do we wall ourselves off from everybody else? Or do my parents actually start to teach me those lessons of community that they've told me were so valuable? Do they start to actually reach across and stretch in different ways, right? And this is where I think equity takes work, because it's not just the idea of you notice something is wrong. You have a responsibility to do something about it. Now, let me be clear. By doing something, it doesn't mean you correct everything. That would be impossible. If somebody told you you could do that, they're lying or they're trying to sell you a book, right? Buy the book, don't buy the BS. Right? This is your opportunity to stretch a little bit more and say, well, what are some of the choices that I could make that could incorporate families that have a little bit less than I do, that don't completely unseat me, don't put you into the quote unquote poorhouse, don't destroy your life, but they actually create greater bonds between us. Our schools are best when communities are strong. In places where communities are weak, those who are most vulnerable lose the most. So for me, I think that it is about thinking about how can I stretch? What can I give up a little bit more of? Because you're not going to actually eliminate the ability for your child to learn. I'm not telling you to, give away your home. I am saying, wait a second. Are all of your friends from the same racial group? Are all of your friends, is everyone English dominant in your neighborhood? And if you start to answer no to those questions, then it says to me, you may not be doing what's best for your child. You may be doing what's best for the maintenance of white supremacy, the maintenance of inequality. And the best for those things is not the best for any of us.
Yeah, I remember I heard you in another presentation ask the question, how much can you give up and still get by? Which I love that question. I think it's such a better question than the way, some of us approach it is like, how can I approximate my normal? Or how can I, make things as close as they were? But how much can I give up and get by is like a much better way to think about that. You talked at the beginning about the three different sort of reasons why people are turning to pods. There's the childcare, there's the academics, and there's the social emotional development. And that somehow all of these things get wrapped up into this one structure, right, of pods.
Yeah.
And that's complicated. That makes it even harder to figure out this already very hard thing. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit like, are there ways to think about each of those needs for our families distinctly that actually open up more options for equity?
Yeah, in fact, I think separating them out is the best place to start, right? And so I'll kind of break my rule and I'll make it 4, right? So there's the safety portion, there's the childcare portion, there's a social emotional portion, and there's the academic portion. Number 1, when we start to say, all right, what do we need to do in terms of safety to be safe, to get by, right? And I think of getting by, particularly in this moment, we're in a crisis. Like, don't try to do normal. Literally doing normal is a very bad idea. Try to do what you can to survive. As folks in my church used to say growing up, wade in the water for a second. Wade in the water. What are the safety things we need to have in place? How do I make sure that my family will be okay, but also as we travel around, that the people around us are safe, right? And so I think about many families are dealing with childcare, but also thinking about the notion of intergenerational households, right? So maybe we're thinking about safety, but we also realize, wait a second, grandma lives here. And if this child is going out and traveling here and here and here, grandma is more vulnerable to this than the child. So now we have to rethink the nexus between the two, right? But we can plan on that and we can build a block around that and figure out, well, what are the resources that exist? About 1 month ago, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hosted a webinar on creating childcare collectives. It's on her YouTube page. It's great information on how to do it at low or no cost, right? So that you can start to think about those things. We also have to think about that social emotional piece. What is it that you want your child to experience? And I have 2 children, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I love them and I've gotten to know them in a way that I would have never imagined. But I'm also like, oh my goodness, you need some peers. You need some peers right now, because there is a way that energy, that exchange, that dynamic helps them grow. And it also allows us to create some continuity for our kids. And I'm not saying normalcy, I'm saying continuity, because it creates an opportunity for a synergy between relationships. Social relationships are valuable. So it may mean that you aren't able to pull off a pod in the way you desire, but you are able to create a bubble with some folks in your network, a bubble drawing from folks, from people in your school who don't live in the same area. And on Saturdays, guess what? We're going to go out and we're going to meet in the park. We're going to have a socially distant meetup, right? Those are some of the needs. That's how we start to address it. Then we get to the academic piece. And the academic piece has to be thought about seriously, but it can also be connected up to what's happening at your local school. I think one of the dangers of pods is that they're completely disconnected from our schools. And a lot of districts have been just straight up hands off. Like, you doing that? Good luck to you, right? And I get to a degree why they do that. But when you don't tend to the scholastic dimensions of school and assist families, there's big gaps there. Because in the springtime, when the pandemic emerged and many families were disconnected because of technology, many families encountered barriers because of language and other forms of barriers, schools didn't magically figure out that problem. In fact, what they often did was they punted until the fall. And now we're in the fall and we have to ask, well, wait. What are we doing for and with those families? We also have to ask, what are we doing with adults? I'm an educator. I've been teaching in the university for 20 years, literally. I know I'm trained to teach in higher education. It's not the same as educating my first grader. They're not the same. So what are some of the things, what are the kind of opportunities that we can use to make a connection and scaffolding around education? But also, what are some of the out of school opportunities for learning and engagement that we can also utilize? There may be a program that has been happening outside of your home for the past 5 years that you've never seen or heard about. As things start to open back up, those community spaces can be tremendous opportunities for edifying educationally. See, if we don't limit education to the idea that if I pay someone a lot of money, they'll make my kid really smart, which they won't. I mean, they're really smart because they're charging you a lot of money, right? But if we get out of that idea that it's this banking notion of education pour into my child's head, then we actually open up possibility. For myself, my partner and I, when COVID hit, we were like, all right, so how do we take the walls off the classroom? In part because many of the classrooms that our kids are in woefully underserve them to begin with. So this gets to be an opportunity for creativity. So as we break those pieces apart, I think we can come up with a multitude of solutions. But if we glob them together, it is very easy to go with the McDonald's menu, right? And to say, all right, I got it. I know how to do this. I'll just, somebody's got money. I'm going to use that money. We're going to hire someone and it's perfect.
Yeah, so we had a question in the Q&A related to this. Somebody asked, is there a role that you can imagine the DOE playing in helping us form non-destructive pods? And is there anyone that you know in the DOE who's actually working on this?
So I can answer, the first one is sure. I can think of a multitude of ways that it could happen. I'll get to the punchline. I don't know many folks in DOE who are working on it, but I think when we look at different cities, so we can look at places like San Francisco, we can look at places in Oakland, right, where folks have moved to a more community hub-based model. This is saying, hey, look, within our community, we already have existing organizations, existing groups that have worked with youth. And we have people who are youth workers who are trained to do this. How do we bring them together to make sure our most vulnerable families have resources that they need? So I know some folks who are doing this in Jersey and other places, and there's challenge to it. But as someone who like literally believes in New York, I'm like, no, we can do this. We can absolutely do this. We have to be the people to do this. If we don't do this, in really the nation's largest set of schools, if we don't find small ways to work on it, and whether we pilot it out, then we're actually giving up the prospect of rethinking, reimagining, and rebuilding education. So I think there is a lot of hope. I think there's a lot of possibility, but so much of DOE's attention has been directed to how to reopen, and then competition over what's actually happening in schools, which goes back to a larger conversation around mayoral control.
Yeah. There's another question somebody asked just around homeschooling and how you see this as connected to the homeschooling tradition. You know, that some of this has obviously been done for years. And do you see a role for home educators, you know, in this whole process, in this dilemma?
Yeah, so I think there are many homeschooling traditions, but I have seen particularly among the Black community, a lot of Black homeschoolers being like, hey, y'all, we've been working on a set of solutions around curriculum, around creativity, around reimagining education. Let's share. So I've literally seen people being like, normally I used to charge for this curriculum, but I want to share it across with people so that you have something. So you're not sitting there saying, what do I do with my child? And I saw that in the spring, I saw it through the summer, and I see that in these moments. There is also the question of, because I think it is very different to commit to homeschooling in full versus saying I'm doing some schooling at home. And oftentimes homeschoolers have a commitment to particular kinds of education that may be connected to content, that may be connected to morals, that may be connected to ethics, right? That looks a little bit different than I'm trying to figure out how to make sure my kid learns times tables while I turn in 3 reports to my job and, you know, make it to racquetball. Those are different things. So I think they are related, but I think they're also distinct. In this moment, there are going to be some families who get excited by the prospect of homeschooling and follow it. So we may see a bump in that, but I think there's something probably more undergirding it philosophically that most of us haven't really thought through as we explore it right now.
Yeah. I'm going to ask another question from the Q&A. Mm-hmm. Sorry, it's a long question, so I'm getting to it. Let's see. Do you have advice for caregivers with financial means and privilege who cannot maintain, this is just sort of what you're talking about, you know, who cannot maintain their responsibilities, like, you know, all of the responsibilities we had when our kids were in school while keeping the school age kids at home to learn remotely. You know, what do you see as the right choice when it feels like you're choosing between having income and, you know, sending your child potentially to a place where COVID can be spread?
Yeah. So I'll tell you in all of this, because I don't like to lie to people. I don't know if there's one right choice, but I think there are choices that you can make in a particular direction. So for me, looking at models of mutual aid of childcare, right? And really saying, how do we arrange? So it may be there are 5 families in your building or neighborhood who have responsibilities to children, and you're going to bring them together. And largely, you're going to rotate the adults that perform the childcare between certain hours, right? So that you can complete work and children have some guidance, but you detach the money and you center the community. So the pandemic has created this moment where folks are like, oh my gosh, we have to invent things from scratch. No, many of these things have been done and can be done. But for middle income and above communities, because of the ethos of the American dream, the idea of things being privatized, the idea of things being monetized, right? We're used to buying things instead of creating them in the midst. So I think this is literally an opportunity to rethink what has value and how you apply the value. So as I've talked to a number of families, they've been like, hey, look, I don't think I could even afford to pay someone to do that. I'm like, great, but could you afford to do a day and work with your boss? And then if you have 5 parents, you actually get that coverage and you build a different kind of community. So that's kind of what I would recommend.
Yeah. And related to that, you know, somebody is also asking, do you know of models that, you know, because so many of these models have been built for white families and for privileged families, do you know of, you know, these kinds of like school without walls, homeschooling models that are African centered, that are not from a Eurocentric perspective that you would recommend people look into?
And I apologize because there is someone literally, and I can see her face, and she has availed herself as a resource to a couple of my friends. And Tamika's name is, her full name is escaping me. I will tell you, person in the Q&A, email me at lewismccoy@nyu.edu, and I will share that name because she has said to me, hey, if there are folks who are interested, if they're Black, if they're interested in African-centered education, have them reach out. Mea culpa, I just can't call their name right now. But yeah, they exist.
Great. I wanted to ask you, you know, another question, and I think I've heard you say this before, LaRue, that, you know, in some ways, by centering this conversation on pod is the wrong conversation, right? That like, just like most things that white parents raise hell about, that it can kind of suck the, you know, that's where the conversation becomes centered, right? And that maybe pods is not the conversation we should be having around equity in schools. And so just wondering, what is the conversation we should be having had this not arisen? And you talked a little bit about this, but I'm just wondering, like, where do you think that privileged parents with, you know, should be putting their time and resources rather than into this, you know, into creating these pods? You know, what is the thing that we should be focused on? How can we kind of shift what the conversation is and what the questions we're even asking ourselves are around this?
Mm-hmm. So I think there are kind of like small shifts and big shifts, right? So when I think about big shifts, even in the narrative, like whenever I sit down with someone to talk about pandemic pods, I of course talk about the people who are paying $100,000 a year to do this. But I'm also like, what about all the folks who have been figuring out how to make ends meet? And what would it mean to ask them how they made ends meet and how can we support them better? I'm like, what would it mean, reporter from Vox, from Vice, to ask them, to start there? And they're like, yeah, that's a good question. I'm like, I think it's a great question. I'd love to hear the answer because we do a lot of talking at people who have been vulnerable, but not a lot of listening to. I think listening to would also help us start to identify what are the gaps in our approaches to even building out online learning and connections to families. We know in traditional schooling that traditional K-12 education has not connected in the same ways with Black Latinx families as it has with white families and more recently a subset of Asian American families. We know that. So we shouldn't think that just because we figured out like, oh, some people like Classroom Dojo, other folks are into Google Classroom, and here's a third, just because we figured that out doesn't mean that we figured out how to actually do quality education across groups. We have to start to interrogate that and work on that and experiment, right? because it may be more place-based learning. It may be something that is very different than what we imagined, but this should be a moment of creativity and creation. Yes, I want schools to open and I want them to be safe. I want to know what schools are doing something creative. What schools are doing the work of safety and education and innovation, because then that also leads to other opportunities. I also think that it is about conversations that are local, right? So making sure that you're in communication, not just with your school, but with your district, your state, and federally, and saying, hey, this is the most expensive reopening of schools we've ever had. If you're face-to-face, PPE is going to cost you. If you're hybrid, PPE and online is going to cost you. If you're like, everything is expensive. And at every level, it's been underfunded and under-resourced. And we need you to pay. Dollars and cents will have an impact on what this looks like for all families. I think you can get even bigger and say, hey, you know, one of the hardest things about this is that we live in a society where we have a very weak social safety net. We don't have universal basic income, right? You can say, hey, if we had that, if we had things like universal childcare, universal basic income, these are things that I'm committed to building pressure behind, I think we end up in a different place the next time we hit a crisis, because there will be a next time. In fact, we're not even through this one, right? That's one of the things that makes me scared, because folks are like, okay, great, schools are reopening, we should be good. And I'm like, yeah, but schools, whether you're talking about pre-K to 12 or higher education, I'm like, they're opening up, but they very well may be the sources of super spreading. So there are so many opportunities to link this to larger conversations, to get us to think about public health in our schools. Here in New York City, this rushed evaluation of air circulation should also get us thinking about where are the places that our kids are learning and how do we invest to make them safe for all. So for me, there are many different ways, but I think anyone listening, pick a place to start. You don't have to do it all. Doing it all is never your job and it's not within your capacity. But doing nothing is an excellent way to back the car up. Take one step, take two. Well, you know what? I can only do two things during the season because I had to figure it out. Great. Those two things are far better than throwing up your hands and far better than investing in a status quo that has made inequality so normative and so deep and so dangerous.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think that is that, you know, a lot of parents feel like, well, it's too big to take on. And these issues actually are too big for any of us to take on individually, right? Like we are all grappling individually in our families with the impact of these enormous inequities. And so for, you know, that point that you don't actually have to do it all or none of it, that you can choose a step, 2 steps that you can take, and, you know, take it from there and try to go a little further next time. Another good question in the Q&A that came up is, do you have any advice for introducing, you know, this, or talking to immigrant communities about the pod concept? So, you know, it's an intimate structure, basically. It's not, you know, I don't think that like this conversation is happening in some communities and not in other communities. And just if you have any thoughts about like how, you know, how is this playing out in immigrant communities, or how might it in a, you know, in a way that could support the families that have a lot of essential workers, you know, that are sort of taking the brunt of the pandemic a lot?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a question that I am working through and learning through in this moment. So as you mentioned earlier, Megan, I am a public school parent. I live in Upper Manhattan. My kids go to school in Washington Heights. The school that my eldest goes to is the dual language immersion school. And we've been having this conversation around pandemic pods, right? And the first thing that happened in the first meeting was like, they were like, particularly our community members who were Spanish language dominant and who were immigrant, were like, yo, this pods language, it's not working. Like they were like, it just sounds very, they were like, it sounds very white. And I was like, you know what? I don't know why, but I think you're right. And so the first thing we did was literally come up with an alternative name so that we can talk about what we're trying to do. 2, you also have to think about means and modes of communication for different communities. So when I say I'm learning, also working with parents and hearing parents say, hey, guess what? No, I don't think the announcement via robocall is going to be most helpful. How do we connect to WhatsApp? How do we get this stuff out? And I was like, dang, of course, many of my folks who are not USians, who are not US based, we use WhatsApp to communicate. And I was like, oh, dang, like there are probably modes of communication that we under theorize, right? Most of this conversation is starting in English dominant spaces and being translated. Huge danger, right? transliteration, like everything that could go wrong starts usually with projects like that. So in our own work, what we've said is literally pause and be like, nope, this is being driven too much by English dominant families, being driven too much by folks who have a certain class position. How do we pause in our planning and bring in more voices? So I think there is a need to, if you're doing collaborative work, to slow down, right? The truth of the matter is that these are big issues. If you don't figure this out by September 15th, guess what? It's still around October 15th and November 15th. But if you rush to do something and leave people on the side, it's a huge danger, and it's often what we do, because we get a couple motivated folks, and particularly for my white folks listening, you get really excited, you get really committed to equity, and you're like, great, we're ready to do this. And then you look around and it's the same people in the room, and you've edged out and you've pushed out people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who have a different set of experiences. And so if we're committed to it, we got to go slow, we got to listen, we got to recalibrate, and we got to think about what are the needs that these communities have. Start with, and it doesn't have to be formal, what's a needs-based assessment, right? And having conversations with families about like, yeah, we can't do it in this home because of this, but we could do it outside here, but we can't do it on that street because like, these are excellent conversations that help you build and understand community in new ways, but they rarely happen. So I think this is our opportunity to not only kind of dream differently, but organize differently too.
Yeah, and it also reminds me of what you said earlier about going to the families that have been making ends meet all this time, that families with means have been relying on those means for childcare, social emotional development, and academics all this time. So that's where we go to, right? That's what families of privilege do. But families without means have been potting, right? They have been looking to each other. They have been relying on their networks, on their extended family, and all of that. And so while it's a new concept, it's actually it's like an organic concept. Often in less privileged communities, that is actually already happening, and that it's really it's new to the privileged families to rely on their networks rather than their means in that particular way.
Yeah, and amplify the work of folks who are doing that in your community. Don't just jack the idea, because like literally I've had people be like, oh, did you know in my neighborhood there's a co-op and I'm gonna do it? And I was like, skirt. Did you talk to the co-op? Like, oh no, but like amplify work and make sure you're in conversation. There's no one who's silent. There are only people who have been silenced. So you may be the one who is so excited, who is so motivated that you're actually drowning out something that needs to be heard from folks who know. There's also folks who know can help you troubleshoot in ways that you wouldn't imagine.
Yeah. Laura, we have kind of put together some principles, right, to help guide families thinking about how to make these decisions, because they're incredibly difficult, they're complex, they're different for each family. So I want to screen share, I'll screen share this sort of equity principles document, and I wonder if you could walk us through it a little bit.
Sure.
Okay, let's try to screen share here. Okay, is my screen visible now?
Your screen is now visible. Yep.
Okay, go for it.
All right. So so there's a preamble. Imagine the preamble is what we've all been talking about, right? So don't think about less, think about more. This is a challenging time. It is literally a challenging time for everyone. So with that in mind, if you're thinking about the challenging time, if you're thinking about equity and you're thinking about pods, the first thing that we think is essential is that you have to be principled and recognize that this is the time for greater, not less solidarity, right? So particularly for folks who are caregivers, who are parents, your kids are looking at you, right? They're literally looking to see what are the lessons of community. So now we can actually teach them what together looks like. We can teach them, maybe you're someone who's talked about, you've lamented the lack of diversity, the lack of equity, the lack of inclusion. Your kids are like, really? Are we diverse, equitable, and inclusive in our house right now? This is the first place to step up, right? So I believe that any good work around equity, any good work around pods, around schools, it's gotta start at home. Don't give me the big speech about, know about government and funding, but your first step is at home. Number two, this is our chance to actually teach our kids what we want them to know. They say that children learn by seeing, not by what you say. I was told many times when I was coming up, do as I say, not as I do. No, do as you do, and then match it up with some sayings, right? Show them like, yes, it takes a village to raise a child. Yes, many hands make light work. And this is how we've made sense of this moment. And this is what created in this moment, so that when they look back, you can account to them and say, hey, here are some everyday decisions we had to make. We had to make some decisions around childcare. We had to make some decisions around academics. We had to make some decisions around who we were going to be in community with. And we made intentional choices. And we thought about it long and hard because we want you to have a different world than what we grew up in. Most equity work, most anti-racist work, most justice work says, hey, look, the world that was given to me, I want to do something better and different so that my children receive something different. The future always runs off into the sunset, into the horizon. The future is now. It's in your action. Number 3, and this is a big one for me, right? This is literally a twin pandemic at least. There is COVID-19, there is anti-Black state violence, and there is the continued threat of COVID-45, right? Now is the time that we actually have to figure out how to build greater safety nets. We actually have to figure out how to make sure that we can stabilize, that we can be safe. Now is not the time to figure out how to get ahead. If the get ahead is in your head, you're actually working against what we need collectively, and individually, you're going to be engaging in a practice that will have consequences, right? You may not see it now, but when we think later down the line, why do our schools look this way? Why have public schools been disinvested in, right? So in some places that I've had conversations with folks are like, oh, I'm gonna pull my kid out of school so that I can do this. We'll come to that later, right? Keep your kid in school. Number 4, think carefully about safety and make sure safety is not code for what's familiar to me. As we talked about a little bit earlier, some of us are rushing towards normal. Some of us are rushing towards what's familiar, but normal and familiar is grossly unequal. And oftentimes it means that you worry about just yourself and not your neighbor, right? And not your cousin and not your classmate, right? We want to actually do something that challenges the status quo. And even if it's unfamiliar, guess what? That probably means you're doing it right. If your life looks the same in this moment as it did before, then you probably are reifying the structures we already have. Number 5, privileged people have to give up something. So I don't know you. You don't know me. But there is a chance, probably a good chance, that you have more than someone else. If you find yourself saying, no, I do enough to get by, and then I have some left over. Maybe you say, oh, I'm doing pretty good. Things have worked out. I mean, the economy's been bad, but the market's been okay. I'm thinking about you. If you had the opportunity to get all of this fancy schmancy education, right? I'm talking about you too. We have got to do something different that stretches us. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's community. Sometimes it is getting uncomfortable to create a situation where others can thrive. Privilege exists in multiple forms. The only ways that you work against individual privilege is to take individual and collective action towards equity. Acknowledgement is not enough. You don't have to do everything, but you got to do some things and be in community with folks who can also say, hey, Megan, that was a good idea, but an even better idea may be you may want to try this, this, and this, right? Because there's a proverb that says the eyes can see everything but themselves, right? There are things that you think are the best you can do that someone's going to help you see something different. And so that means we have to get out of our comfort zones. But as we get out of our comfort zones, we also have to recognize how many different things are happening at once. Your comfort zone could be related to who you're used to seeing, but it's also probably tied to race, to class, to immigration status, to language, to disability, to sexual orientation, to gender identity, employment. Like all of these things get wrapped up. And how do they get wrapped up? So I've used this example a couple times as I'm talking to folks. So sometimes I'm talking to people who are like, I'm going to build a pod and I'm going to make sure, I'm going to make sure to bring somebody in the pod who normally wouldn't be invited. Maybe we're paying for childcare, maybe we're paying for a teacher, but I'm gonna bring them in because I wanna bring them in, they're the scholarship kid. And I'm like, okay, well, what happens when your scholarship child, right, comes in on a Tuesday in November and they have a cough, right? Kids have coughs in November all the time. But the child you invited in, the child that you paid for, I'm doing a lot of air quotes here, I know you can't see me, right? Are you going to say to that child, hey, have a seat, all right, let's work through the day, make sure you cover your nose? Or are you going to start nudging the other parents and other families like, wait a second, I don't know if they have COVID, maybe we should send them home, right? And do the families have equal decision-making power? Because if you bring folks in and they don't have equal decision-making power, you have not done equity work, you've done charity. And charity is lovely, but it's not justice. It keeps in place the fundamentally unequal systems, and it allows those systems not to change, and it assumes that goodwill is enough. Number 7, beware of the warning signs. As we're thinking about potting, right? There's gonna be a lot of portions where you should pause. And I haven't met a parent yet who hasn't needed to pause, right? So maybe you're doing a pod or a childcare organization or a club, whatever you want to call it, constellation, and everybody is from an English dominant family. English is spoken at home, pause. Particularly if you live in New York, like where, how, why, right? If everybody in your pod is from the same race or class background, pause. Yeah, guess what? You may not have a lot of money, but you do have a degree, and that automatically puts you in a different place. Well, maybe you've decided to hire a tutor and you've decided to bring one child in, but then you look and you're like, I've done my work because 1 out of 4 of our kids is from an economically disadvantaged area. And you look and your school district is 60% free and reduced lunch. Yes, you did something good, but the collective need has not been addressed. There may be a need to not just invest in having someone in your pod, but also to rethink, reimagine, and put pressure on schools and districts to do something for the families who have greatest needs. So yeah, you can see the different places to pause, right? If your family has more privilege, and make sure that when you pause, you take a second to rethink what you're doing. Just because you have to pause on something doesn't mean it's not worth it. It in fact means you have an opportunity to correct path and make something better that's actually effective and something that's worth fighting for. If in your planning you're not forced to pause, you don't have the right people around you or with you. There's not a collaboratively planned thing that doesn't have to reevaluate, recalibrate, because that creates the opportunity for greatest good. Number 8, and this is one that is a challenge for some folks, but I think very fundamentally, I believe in public education. The majority of our children get educated through public education. And as I spoke about earlier, there's inequity in school funding. There have been districts, there have been private pod organizations as well who have said, hey, look, the best way you can help your school system is that there are kids who need to be in school, there are kids who don't have these resources, so you should disenroll from your school and come to my pod, right? And some places are like, in order to participate, you have to register with us, right? This is a Jedi mind trick. This is neoliberalism at its finest. One, and many schools throughout the country, schools have budgets based on how many children are there. So if you're in a school and it's a school of 350 families disenroll, and they are also the most affluent, most well-resourced, that also means what the school thought they were going to get in their budget, they may not, right? It means that oftentimes by disenrolling, you are continuing a process of divestment. For me, the most logical thing is to stay enrolled and do that, right? There is a moment that we are in politically where public schools are called government schools, where in states across the country, there's been an emphasis on face-to-face meeting. And some state legislatures have said, if your child's public school is not going face-to-face, I'm going to make it so you can take your money and put it into a private school, even when private schools aren't mandated to be face-to-face. This is a project of privatization and the dismantling of public education. We academics like to use this fancy word of neoliberalism, which simply means convince people that the government can't do its job and that private companies can. You should know the more and more a thing becomes privatized, the less and less equitable and accessible it becomes. I think the more we fight for all of our children, the more we keep these things in mind, the more we can actually get to a place of greater equity. These choices will not eliminate inequality, right? Let me be clear. What we're doing in the midst of a crisis is trying to make sure the gap doesn't get wider and wider and wider. We're trying to mitigate so we have an opportunity to do something different.
Great. Thank you, LaRue. And I just want to add to folks that you have the link, and we really do think of this as a working document. If there are principles that you think should be added to this, we would love to get your ideas. So please do email us, let us know if there's, how do you think about this question? What are some of the guiding principles that you think about when it comes to these decisions? And we love to add it in here, have it be sort of an ongoing document. So, Dr. Lewis McCoy, we come to the end of this section. Thank you very much. This is great, really rich ideas. Not at all. This is wonderful. I am going to pass it to Richard, who is going to sort of introduce the next sections, and then we'll come back. But let me just, is there anything else that you want to add right now before we go to the next section? I know you'll have some time to wrap up at the end as well, but anything else you'd like to add that we didn't ask you?
Nope,
okay.
Proceed. Y'all rock out.
All right. Thanks. Richard, passing it to you.
You're on mute.
Mute. That's what it's always. I would have a dime for every time I've done that on Zoom, then I would have lots of dimes. So I first want to thank LaRue and Megan for that great conversation. I could see the questions and comments, and we really appreciate you setting the context for us here. And again, we'll be looking forward to hear your comments at the end. Now I want to turn it over to my colleague, Barbara Gross, as we go from our conversation in the beginning to think about practices. Barbara's going to go through some examples of some emerging practices that can help to shape our conversation. Barbara?
Yes, thank you, Richard. Cindy, can you put the document on the screen and also in the chat? So there's so much I want to say in response to what LaRue just talked about, but of course I can't because we're very short on time, and I'm going to move through this maybe faster than I would have. And I just want to anchor this by saying two things. One, we're moving now to kind of what individual families and parents may be thinking about, to some practices that schools and parent groups connected to schools are putting into place. And of course, we know there are emerging practices that this is an unprecedented time, and none of this is actually operational yet. These are things that people are really trying and thinking about, although some of the mutual aid has, of course, carried over from the spring. And so, and apologies in advance for talking fast, but I want to make sure we have time for the action and advocacy part after I'm done. So there's 7 or 8 emerging practices on here. I'm sure there are many more. And I'm going to ask also that if you know of any, that you share them. There's an email address on the bottom of the document. You can share them with us. But so one thing is that some schools are actually driven usually by parent groups, PTAs or parent groups, developing school-based principles to guide decision-making of individual families and classrooms. Not unlike the principles that we just shared, but more specific to the school. And second, of course, like mutual aid has been driving so much of the work inside schools. And as we touched on, like some school communities, especially where there's large immigrant populations and intergenerational families, like childcare is really not the issue. Those of us that don't have that kind of community are struggling with that, but it's really important to actually know what people need. And when surveyed, often rather than seeking that childcare or pods, people are looking for tutoring or support or help with their internet access, with remote instruction, or help with translation, or I said tutoring already. And there's a school that raised a ton of money in Brooklyn, in Flatbush, in the spring, because the community was filled with essential workers and people were getting sick and they lost family members. And the money that was raised actually was able to support family members who lost people and lost income and lost access to food. And there's still funding in that, and they're figuring out how to use that to pay for tutors and technical support when it doesn't exist in the community. But there's also a multilingual parent committee that exists to support other families in those same kind of ways. So that, you know, people giving and people getting what they need. The next thing, as I was talking to people in schools and exploring this, that's really important is communication. And, you know, LaRue said that no one is silent, only silenced. And that really struck me, and it's come up. So some schools that are really taking this seriously are having regular weekly all school or grade level Zoom meetings, doing surveys, texting people and calling people. And I think this next point is to LaRue's point, like not everybody is responsive to surveys or emails, and therefore following up with texts and phone calls through grades or class-based phone trees or a volunteer committee, like I just mentioned, is really critical. And it is on those of us that are more privileged and on school communities and school staff to actually take that seriously. Like if people aren't participating, to figure out why and to go after them, because we can't actually do equity if we're not engaging the folks from all parts of our community. And I think people know there have been a lot of surveys school-wide and grade-based, and they've varied greatly from very, very detailed to more broad, but have been used to try to help, in some cases, pods form or figure out other ways of meeting the needs of families. And that leads like into the next point about pooling resources. So one school community is actually asking privileged parents who plan to pay for a teacher or childcare provider to consider paying half of what they might have paid and putting half into a pool that will support childcare for everybody. Another is asking parents that are paying for after-school activities to do something similar, to pay double so another family can access it, or at least make a donation greater than the cost of their own child's participation. And that's, you know, there are many different ways that people are thinking about using money that we have access to in that kind of way. Then people are pooling skills, as mentioned above, like in volunteer committees to help with translation, tutoring, and other activities that come up. A Brooklyn school is setting up, and the school administration is involved in this, but it's really driven by parents, what they're calling off-day care. And for families that are doing hybrid schooling, they have set up an inclusive childcare program that's going to be housed in a church. They're working on making sure it's free for folks that are doing hybrid learning on their off days. It seems, for technical reasons, a little bit harder to make it free for everybody if you're not doing it all those days, or if you're doing all remote learning, but they're working on that. One thing I loved was this idea of a resource hub. Although again, if it's online, there's going to be families that don't access that, and we have to be really cognizant and really intentional about reaching those families. But a kind of one-stop shop where you can turn to it to be matched for pods. And in this case, they're doing outdoor pods of up to 9 students. And you could hopefully access tutors. They are also raising money to contract with an agency that provides tutors. They may even be able to get a tent for forming an outdoor pod. But you can request and offer different kinds of supports on this resource hub. And then the last thing that I loved is this idea of pairing pods or tripling pods so that you might not have figured out or yet to pod across race and class. And you know, if we don't have those relationships already, and I know this has been mentioned, it's a very hard moment to build them, to build the kind of trust required to be in each other's houses in a global pandemic when there's so many risk factors and for all sorts of reasons. But what you can do is partner across pods for outdoor activities, for recreational activities. You can offer to host children from other pods and your child's class in outdoors in a park or something like that. And I feel like I'm talking so fast. I just want to name some of the challenges before I turn it back over to Richard. And, you know, I think the biggest really are around communications. Like I've heard people say, and if you're on the call, if you're watching, this is not a judgment, but I've heard people say, yeah, we haven't been able to figure out the translation, or we really don't know why the other half of the school hasn't filled out the survey, or like that. We really have to push ourselves there, right? We really have to go beyond the survey and beyond online and follow up with phone calls to families and set up the structures to be able to do that. Translation is a big challenge, and it's especially on Zoom, but folks have figured it out. And we work real closely with groups that have, so feel free to email us and we can help with that. You know, there are no precedents, and a lot of this takes a lot of capacity that as individual parents, we're really trying to figure out so many pieces. And schools right now, if you're a teacher or an administrator, you are kind of going crazy figuring out how you're going to provide remote and in-school instruction and do everything else connected to this pandemic. And yeah, so capacity is a big thing. And, you know, on the relationship piece, I wanted to say this and I didn't. So if we don't have those relationships yet, it's kind of like LaRue said, that this is a moment, and school is starting, though later than we thought, and who knows, it could start even later than that. But if we don't have the relationships yet that we want to build to create the community in our schools that I think we're all aspiring to, we can still do that. Like, it's not linear, it's not one or the other. We can reach out to folks, even if they're not in our pod. We can push our schools as things settle a little bit after next week. We can push our schools to help create the different kinds of communication and ways to connect. And I'm going to stop because it's 6:21. So thank you. And there's an email address, definitely reach out.
Thank you, Barbara. I know you had to talk fast, but there were lots of comments about the quality of the document. And as Barbara and Megan set up, this is a living document, and so we really want there to be feedback. I think there was a request for the document, and the link has been put into the chat. We welcome people to engage in this conversation. Again, we feel as though you get a better process for decision making when you are more inclusive and participatory. And so your idea may be the one that helps us to move forward in a way that we can't without you sharing it with us. So please share that. And now I want to turn it over from now the practice to the action, and have my colleague, the executive director of AQE, Jasmine Gripper, come up and talk to us about some actions that are going on that you can take part in. Jasmine.
Thank you for having me. This has been such a rich conversation. My name is Jasmine Gripper. I am the executive director of the statewide education advocacy group, the Alliance for Quality Education. We primarily focus on the school funding fight. So something that Professor mentioned earlier was that the ongoing issues in our education system that persist and that create the opportunity gap is funding for schools. And what we know is true is that when a school serves, the majority of the students are Black and brown, low income or immigrant students, that school is likely to be severely underfunded. And we see that funding gap happening at the state level and then replicated again at the city level. And so one of the major things that's happening right now, like literally right now, is Governor Cuomo is threatening to cut 20% of funding from our schools. A 20% cut to education will be absolutely devastating to our high need school districts across the state. For New York City, it would mean $2 billion of a cut. The chancellor has already said that would mean about 9,000 educators laid off. And so think about what we just heard. Education right now costs more, not less, right? Students meeting in person or a hybrid approach, addressing the needs of students is not something that can be done on the cheap. And if we don't invest the resources in our kids now, we will pay the price later. And for a whole generation of students, they will lose out on educational opportunities. And so AQE has been doing advocacy on stopping the Cuomo cuts to our schools. And I know we're in a financial crisis and the pandemic has led to an economic recession. And the easy thing to believe is, well, the state doesn't have money, so they have to make cuts. And so this just may need to be the case. And that is absolutely not true. Budgets are about priorities and they're about choices. We can choose to balance the budget on the backs of Black and brown students, or we can choose to have the ultra rich in New York State pay a little bit more in taxes and raise revenue for our state. We have a whole campaign called Make Billionaires Pay. There's a website, if someone can drop it in the chat, called makebillionairespay.info. Make billionaires with a B, pay.info. And this website lists 14 bills that currently exist in the state legislature on ways to have a more progressive tax structure instead of the regressive one. And so we don't need to make cuts right now. We can actually fully fund our schools through this crisis if we make the ultra millionaires pay a little bit more. And I'm talking about a 1 to 2% increase on their taxes, nothing severe. So there's an action you can take right now. I'm going to put a link in the chat. It is an email action to Governor Cuomo and to your state legislature right now that says stop the Cuomo cuts and fully fund our schools. So I just dropped that link in the chat. If you go to that link right now, and you can already see, I think the last time I checked, there were about 1,500 people that already took action. You take action now. Go ahead, put your address in. It will automatically email your state representative. And there's a twofold ask in there. It's saying stop the cuts by one, tapping into the state's rainy day reserves. Our state has billions of dollars in rainy day funds. This is a rainy day. That is the short-term solution to deal with the cash flow issue. The long-term solution is raising taxes on the ultra-rich. And so that's exactly what the email will go to your state elected official will say. And then once you take that action, share it. Share it on social media, share it, text it to your friends, have other people take that action. We're planning a march or rally on September 8th outside of Governor Cuomo's office. It's calling to protect our schools. And we have another action in New York City on September 12th. And so to keep up with what AQE is doing and to be a part of the ongoing advocacy for equity in education, please follow us across social media. We're on all of the platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at AQENY. And our website is aqeny.org. So you can stay up to date on all the latest information and be a part of the advocacy for all the children in New York State, especially children in high-need communities, in order to really achieve equity. I'll stop there because I know we're short on time. Megan, was there anything else that you wanted me to bring up on as part of my presentation? Or are we good?
You want to say a little something about this Freedom Schools?
Yes, I wasn't sure who was still doing that. So Freedom Schools. So, we talked a lot about pods and what we can do in our exclusive pods. And a lot of us have been thinking about this new a more transformative idea of freedom schools. And you all have heard that term before, especially from the 1960s, the civil rights movement. Freedom schools were built on educating voters and getting them involved in our democracy and knowing their rights. And so we are taking that idea of freedom schools and we're applying it to now. What do parents need in order to be successful, in order to help understand what's required at this time? You are a parent thrown into home or online education, and you now have to be essentially like a co-teacher to your child. What does that mean? How do you help the child in your house or the children in your household? How do you help the children in your building if possible? And how do you help the kids on your block, right? How can you have your own freedom school or pod? And so what we're trying to do is connect educators who can be volunteers, who can provide resources and online virtual teachings that we can share and connect that with parents. So for a parent, what kind of schedule should you have for early childhood education for your young first graders? Parents, how do you support your child learning how to do fractions? What things can you do to unpack the stress of the COVID-19 pandemic? So these are some of the things we'll be learning together in our freedom schools. So it will be a resource hub to support parents. So there's two ways you can help with that. One, can you help provide resources? Is there an area of expertise that you can jump in here and provide? You want to facilitate a session on breathing and relaxation. You want to facilitate a section on math or elementary school math. All of those things are required. Can you volunteer your time in order to provide some education or your expertise to parents? And then the other is if you are the one in need of the service, right? You are a parent and you're like, I don't know how to do this. I need help. We want to connect with you and you can sign up to participate. So I'm hoping someone's dropping those links in the chat. The two links, if you want to offer your expertise as a facilitator and share your knowledge with the community, we welcome it. And then if you are a parent or a caregiver in need of support, sign up to be a part of the Freedom School community. Richard, I think that's all from me, and I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Appreciate you. Appreciate the work, as someone said, of AQE and organizations that are really advocating for this, in this moment of equity. When we say we don't have money, I think you brought up the point, when we want to do something, we find a way to do it. And so how do we expand that we to include the students and communities that have been most impacted in this time? So I want to thank all of my colleagues, Jasmine, Barbara, Megan, Cindy, who has been playing a critical role in the technical side to close this out. Please go into the chat. You'll see a number of the links there for documents. People have been requesting opportunities to share your last thoughts. But to close this out, I wanted to give you a chance to give us some closing thoughts, both on what you heard post and just what you want to leave folks with as we're concluding our conversation.
So first, just a profound thanks to everyone in the virtual room and the folks who are doing the continued work to help us build the education that our kids so deserve. And so if something I said didn't resonate, I hope something that Megan said, I hope something that Barbara said, I hope something that Jasmine said resonated. There are a million different places that you can plug in, but the greatest thing you can do is plug in and make a sacrifice. I know that there are so many folks in the room who have resources, so I'm looking forward to the conversation that continues from here. Now, and with one of my favorite proverbs, if you want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, go together. So I'm ready to roll with y'all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody here. We could have these conversations by ourselves in this moment, but I think there were a couple of elements that are really critical. The one about relationships. We've noticed in this moment, if you've had relationships, you can rely on these relationships in moments of crisis. And so how do we use this as a time to not only rely on the relationships we have, but as we've talked about, how do we create new relationships that not only service us, but actually serve communities and others in some way, which leads me to the other point of expanding the we. We say we the people, but over the period of time, we've expanded what that notion of we is. And if we rely just on the we know, we keep going to the same we all the time. So this is an opportunity for us to be able to expand. When we say we, who are we including? And how do we interrogate our own notions of both privilege and blockage in terms of who do we include in that we that has a critical part of our the conversation that we need. So this becomes a way to do that. And then the last that I think is important is capacity and resources. I mean, this is a moment when we need resources, where we should be really pushing in and investing in things that were named here, community schools, things that are really central to supporting the kinds of things that we're looking for. And so how do we make sure that, as Jasmine says, our budget and our money is where our mouth and our values are. And so with all those critical elements, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank all of you. Please go to the links to get resources. If you have any questions, we're actually saving the chat, so it'll be a resource for us and for you. And we thank you all again. Have a great night.